Welcome you all very, very much. It's wonderful to see this room so full, and I know that it's overflowing. And welcoming, a very warm welcome to the panelists, to all four of them. We have a really outstanding panel: Lord Nicholas Stern, Professor Stiglitz, and then we have a representative from the World Bank, Jan Perry, and then we have Adele. Oh, I got it wrong here in my, okay. And then we have Adele Morris, who's leading the whole day in a way, because this is a day of launching a Brookings-wide cooperative effort on climate and energy across all departments, all parts of Brookings. So it's a very special day, and thank you all very much. Before introducing the panelists, let me just note that Lord Stern and Joe Stiglitz are co-chairs of the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices. The Commission is in turn supported by the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, which was created by the World Bank. Minister Ségolène Royal from France, who is co-chair of the CPLC, regrettably could not participate. She was trying to make it, but somehow the plane was too late to fit it in. But she sends her best regards and wishes of success. Adele Morris is Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at Brookings, where she directs the Climate and Energy Economics Project. She was a senior economist at the US Congress, worked at US Treasury as a chief natural resource economist, and also worked for a while as a lead US negotiator on land use and forestry issues as part of the climate change treaty process. She held several government positions prior to that. So Adele, a really warm thanks to you, because you took a lot of leadership, a lot of hard work to get us to this point today. Thank you very much. Harmon Perry, is that the right name? For the, oh, Ian Perry, okay. Is Principal Environment Fiscal Policy Expert in the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department. Before joining the fund in 2010, he held the Alan Neese Chair in Environmental Economics at Resources for the Future. He co-authored the 2014 very important IM working paper, How Much Carbon Pricing is in Countries' Own Interests, the Critical Role of Co-Benefits. And over lunch, this was touched upon. It's a global issue, it's a global public good. I think Nick Stern called the issues around climate once the biggest market failure in history, but there is also something very local about it. And to stress the local benefits, which have positive global spillover effects, was your topic, and I think is now today a very important part of the whole discussion, and is very helpful. Lord Nicholas Stern is I.J. Patel Professor of Economics and Government and Chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Since 2013, Nick has been President of the British Academy. In addition to many other positions, he co-chairs the Global Commission for the Economy and the Climate. Now, sorry, I get lost a little bit in all the commissions that exist, but there are a few. Nick was chief economist at the World Bank and at the EBRD, and I had the privilege to have an office very close to Nick, so that's where we started to know each other. We knew each other from before, but we got to know each other better. While at the UK Treasury, Nick headed the 2006 Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change. And I think that really was a turning point in the whole debate. There was always a group of people who worried about climate, who knew about the issues, but the economics profession, broadly defined, pretty much ignored it. I do remember being part of a commission created by the World Bank. We had our first meeting, I think it was in 2005, on long-term growth. And there were very eminent people, ex-ministers. Robert Solow was a member, Nobel Prize winners, and so on. And we had a one-day meeting in New York on growth, and nobody, including myself, I mean, I was just as guilty as all others, mentioned climate and climate change. And this was 2005. So it's fairly recent that this has become really a mainstream topic in the economics profession and also in the geostrategic sphere and politics. And I think Nick's, the Stern Review, the way as it is called, was the turning point. I mean, it was the moment when the profession started really focusing on the issue, with very controversial articles on discount rates and things like that. I'll come back to that for a minute. Nick has written a new book. His latest book is Why Are We Waiting? The Logic, Urgency, and Promise of Tackling Climate Change. So Nick, thanks a lot for being here. And then Joe Stiglitz needs absolutely no introduction, but he will still get some introduction. Joe has been active on this for years and has joined forces with Nick in heading this commission. He is professor at Columbia University and is also the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. Among his many positions, he is co-founder and co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, which helps emerging countries, developing countries in their policy dialogue with the rest of the world. It's just those countries, right? It's restricted to the emerging and developing countries. And he also co-chairs the OECD's high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress. Joe was a chief economist at the World Bank, and at that time he was my boss, indirectly at least, and I have very fond memories of that. And also, of course, he headed the US Council of Economic Advisors. He was awarded the Nobel Prize, his Nobel laureate of 2001 in economics. Joe has written widely on globalization, inequality, growth, development. I think it says here much more, and I think that's the good way to put it, because if I started continuing, it would take quite a bit of time. His most recent book is The Euro, How a Common Currency Threatens the Future of Europe. And we've had some discussions on that book. And I haven't read I read bits and pieces, but I'm glad to report that it's not what I would call an anti-Europe book or anti-Euro book, but it contains some constructive suggestions of how to salvage the project. And salvaging the project, I think, means a lot in today's world, geostrategically and including for energy and climate questions. I just realized this morning that the UK had declared elections in June the 8th. Next Sunday, there are elections in France. The German elections have to be held, I think, before the end of September. And the Italian elections will have to be held, I think, in November at the latest, perhaps earlier. So we have the four largest and three of them founding members of the European Commission, the European Union project, really having elections at a time when the US just had its own election, of course, very momentously important elections, and where the debate on energy, climate, growth, the future of work, unemployment, and development are very big topics, and they're all interwoven. I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to kind of briefly explain how I came to the topic, and I think how many economists got to the topic. And of course, as a caricature a wrong caricature to start with, but as a caricature, is you have a multi-sector growth model with production functions, demand functions, constraints, and so on, and an objective function which you minimize, which is weighted by time sum of the income, or you can weight it differently, but by some kind of income welfare or economic satisfaction in the objective function. And that did not usually include environmental sustainability per se, or environmental quality of life per se. And also these models didn't have carbon as an input. And therefore the whole climate issue was not part of this model. And I think the early discussions were very simplistic in a sense, but naturally, because that's where growth theories kind of came from, you introduce a new constraint, namely a carbon budget of some sort, with a new input into the production functions, which cannot be used in an unlimited way because it has some negative effects on production, consumption, quality of life, and components of the welfare function. So when you introduce a new and binding constraint into a multi-year growth model, be it a linear growth model or a nonlinear model, you have, first of all, a shadow price for that constraint that there emerges. And second, you lower the objective function. In other words, there is a cost. You cannot introduce new constraints and not have costs. And a lot of the early debate was about the size of these costs, the distribution over time, and of course also the distribution over place. And it took the profession quite a while to start thinking of it somewhat differently, and nobody contributed more to that, I think, than Nick and Joe did. And of course, what's missing from the simple model are learning effects, endogenous technology changes, which are brought about by the price of the newly scarce input. And also what's missing is the fact of the incentives, not just the learning effects, but the incentives that future prices have on today's R&D expenditure and today's investments. And because these are very long-term investments for many of them, particularly energy and urban, which together account for a huge amount of the carbon we're talking about, it changes the whole nature of the problem. The other side of the debate is regulation versus prices, but that in a way is less essential, I think, than to realize that the original kind of framework that the economists had in their mind was missing this very important technological learning and projection effect. And I'm still sometimes surprised when corporations who are really, hard players when it comes to profit maximization and so on, seem to be behaving in a way that is much more, how shall I say, socially benevolent. Not all of them, of course, but many of them in the area of climate and energy. And I think another thing that has changed, I don't think there's agreement in the science on exact numbers. There are always ranges. Nick Stern has taught me that. And these ranges are probabilities. If you keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial times, this is what the range of emissions that this is compatible with, and so on. But what is now becoming, I would say, as certain as one can be in science in general, because nothing is 100% certain, but it's very, very high level of certainty, is that there is in fact a cost. This is not a figment of the imagination, that it is linked to human activity, to urbanization, to energy, to forestry, to land use, and so on, and that sometime in the not too distant future, these costs will become substantial, and some of them we are already observing today in some areas. There's debate as to how much is due to climate change versus how much is due to cyclical phenomenon. There's not a wide agreement, full agreement on what is caused exactly by what. But I think 95% of people who have at all studied the topic and thought about the topic, far from being experts, know that in the future there is going to be either a shadow price in terms of regulations and so on, or an actual price of carbon. And that, I think, has led to a major shift in the behavior of the private sector. Because if you know that this is going to happen in the future, even if you don't know the details and the amounts, there is a very real incentive to change your behavior now, and there's an incentive even to be first mover. If you can develop technologies that reduce carbon emissions and protect climate more rapidly than others, your profits are likely to go up, and you're able to compete much more strongly against your competitors who have not done this and who have not realized that. So while there's a huge amount of uncertainty in terms of the exact numbers and the exact paths, there's very little uncertainty of the direction we're heading for. And I think this is the paradigm shift, that has taken place from the simple linear programming model or non-linear programming model, where the whole emphasis was really on the discount rate you put in the objective function. There were many, many articles debating the size of the discount rate. That's a part of the story, but it's become, in fact, a much smaller part of the story. The bigger part of the story is the learning effect and the possibilities, the incentives, and the market effects of knowing that something like that is going to happen. So I thought, as somebody who's not in the field, who's not studied this in great detail, but as an economist, that was my kind of intellectual journey, so to speak, from where I am today compared to 10 years ago, where I thought the discount rate was really the critical variable. And last point, shadow prices are important. I mean, actual prices are better, and they will guide resources more surely. But if people have some confidence that shadow prices reflect future likelihoods, then shadow prices can influence behavior right now, even if there isn't an actual price. So anyway, these were some of the thoughts that I wanted to express. I hope that we are at a turning point here, and I do agree with those who say that the US has to be absolutely part of it. I don't think one can move this forward very much without US, and US broadly defined. I just don't mean just the federal government, but American cities, business, NGOs, and so on and so forth, because then the gaming aspects of the whole story become very negative. In other words, everybody waits on the other to move, and with the US being the strongest and by far the most powerful country, and also in terms of GDP, at market prices, still the largest economy, it would be very hard to move very, very much forward without the US. So I very much hope that the US will remain, as it is now, not only part of the Paris Agreement, but also in terms of behavior, some of the best technologies that are being developed, some of the best examples that are being set are actually set in the US. And so building on that, I think there's a lot to hope for. But I do believe the story is complicated. What Nick and Joe are great at, among others also, is to simplify it in such a way that the average citizen can understand it. Because if it's not understood, then a future danger is something that people tend to ignore or don't want to think about. Okay, with these words, I'll ask Nick first and then Joe to make a small presentation of about 7 to 8 minutes or so each, and then we'll all sit around here and start debate, in a kind of panel debate, into which we'll bring the audience after the first few questions to the panel itself. But thank you, and I also have to single out one more person, probably many more persons that I'm forgetting, but one more person, my colleague, my friend, Amar Bhattacharya, who has worked relentlessly to make this happen, to bring the various pieces together, to bring the various organizations together, private, public, municipal, federal, and whom I think, quite honestly, all of us who are interested in this topic, we owe Amar a lot. So thank you, Amar. Thank you very much. Nick, I cede you the chair here.
Thank you, Kemal, for a very thoughtful introduction, which raises a lot of questions, which I hope we'll go into in the discussion. But at a very headline level, what you were describing is dynamic public economics. Dynamic public economics as if time mattered. Pace, urgency is the essence here because it's the cumulative total of emissions that counts. Public economics in the sense that people's learning, people's understanding of issues change, and indeed public policy should think about how to induce changes in that learning. Dynamic public economics in the sense that any kinds of evaluations of gains in the future versus gains now are going to depend very strongly on how well off you think you might be in the future relative to how well off you might think now. So anybody who talks about the discount rate goes straight to the bottom of the class, because what matters is that there are many discount rates depending on not only obviously the good that you look at, but also what kinds of circumstances you imagine for the future. And those, of course, are, if you excuse the words, intensely endogenous. The risks that we run depend on what we do now. So all the things you raised, Kemal, are at the heart of this story. And just as a headline, it's about dynamic public economics. And we have to learn there's not going to be one model that's going to drive dynamic public economics, but there are going to be a range of careful arguments, some of which involve explicit models that are going to drive that story through. And Joe's going to say something about that after I'm done, because what I'm going to try to do is to move very quickly through where we are now on our, it always makes me laugh, but it's a high-level commission on, now you wouldn't want to be a low-level commission on carbon pricing. Anyway, that's who we are. We were invited, Joe and I, to chair this commission by Ségolène Royal and Feike Sibesma, and who are the co-chairs of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. We've had the real blessing of a very strong secretariat with John Room and Stefan Holgate and Celine and others involved, and we're very grateful to them for all the work that they've done. And thank you again, Amar and Adele and Brookings, for your support and advice and guidance. And of course, Adele is part of the commission. So that's the commission. I won't go through all the names. I think they're on the last slide anyway, which I'll leave up. But they go from Mali to China and Brazil to Chicago and so on. So it's a very broad, but nobody represents anybody other than themselves. So that's the commission. That's who asked us to be a commission. So let's start with the question. I used to attend Nicky Kaldor and Joan Robinson's lectures in Cambridge in the 1960s, and Joan Robinson always thought it was original to say, what's the question? But it doesn't matter. What is the question? So our question is, what kinds of pricing structures, varying over space, varying over assumptions, varying over time, so we talk about corridors of prices, what kinds of prices, coupled with sensible, reasonably wise other policies, we also ask the question, what prices do you need if they're not so wise, but what kind of prices could be expected to induce changes in emissions through behavior, investment, and so on, consistent with staying well below 2 degrees. So how do you use prices to deliver on Paris in shorthand is what we were asked to do, and it is important. Note that expressing it that way it indicates straight away that we are not examining or discussing the social cost of carbon as measured by the kinds of social damages that an extra ton of carbon would bring to the world. That itself, of course, is enormously dependent on what kind of path you think you're going to follow for the reasons I've already discussed. That's not where we are, but we observe in an appendix that because most modelings of the social cost of carbon, most modelings used in the estimation social cost of carbon leave out so much of what really matters in terms of risks that one can say that whatever numbers they come up with, they are very serious underestimates of what that might be. We leave the question there and we put it in an appendix because it wasn't the question we were asked. Whatever the interest in that question, and there is an interest in that question, but that's not the question that we had. Why we don't dissect the Paris Agreement and wonder too much about why people did it and whether they should have done. I actually think they did it for very good reason. But just this one slide here is that why did it come about? Well, obviously an understanding that these risks of climate change, even though you can't be precise, were potentially immense, existential for many. That the promises put on the table in terms of the nationally determined contributions, the indications of where countries would be in 2030 on their current plans, where they try to do something for this challenge, fall way short of what's necessary in terms of reductions for 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees. So a recognition of why it matters, a recognition that we're falling short in terms of current plans as embodied in the Paris Agreement, a recognition that this involves very radical change. The world economy will double in the next 20 years or so, infrastructure will more than double, and in that time we have to reduce total emissions absolutely by about 20%. So that's an indication of just how big these changes would have to be. But many of us take the view they're feasible, they're exciting, they're attractive, they bring other things with it. And not only is climate policies, if done well, consistent with growth and development and poverty reduction, but there is potentially, if we're able to realize it, a rather attractive growth story there, a kind of growth that is much more attractive indeed than that which involves cities where you can't move and breathe and ecosystems that collapse. So that's enough on why we did it all as a world, and we did do it all as a world, nearly 200 countries in Paris in December 2015, an agreement that applies to everybody. We start also with a clear understanding that economic incentives matter, no matter how much you go on about market imperfections, and we do, because they're important here, not just the imperfection in the greenhouse gas externality, but also around capital markets, networks, R&D and learning, clearly important market imperfections there. Given all that, it is still true that prices are very important incentives, and a carbon price is a very important incentive. It is obviously deeply mad to pursue fossil fuel subsidies at a time when you ought to be increasing carbon prices. And also we take a reasonably broad view of a carbon price and recognize that shadow pricing in public sector activity can be very important, and internal pricing in firms can be very important. We don't dwell on those, we do note them and emphasize their importance. We're talking mostly about carbon prices. So carbon prices are at the center of the story, although they're not the only thing at the center of the story of inducing change on the scale that's necessary. Packages will come together. I've already indicated other important externalities such as R&D, networks, capital markets, and of course the immense potential co-benefits of reduced pollution. So there will be part of packages. Those packages will vary across countries because the challenges in different countries are different, the endowments in different countries are different, the price of complementary resources are different. Those are all reasons why policy package to induce the kind of change that we're talking about would vary across country. At the same time, support from one country to another, and it doesn't have to be all one way from rich to poor countries, but that will be a big part of the story. International cooperation and support will be very important in this story, and the overall efficiency globally of carbon reductions is important. The ability to make the very big investments that we're describing here would involve quite a lot of support in some circumstances. So having set that up in terms of what question we're asking about carbon prices, why other policies will matter, but what are our lines of evidence on what those carbon prices could be. Well, one is to look at what kind of prices, given what we know or given what we might anticipate about technologies, what kind of prices could induce a switch. And there's quite a lot of evidence now on that. The second body of evidence has been quite a lot of detailed studies, the deep decarbonization pathways was one of those, but quite a lot of national studies about what's involved. In my own country, United Kingdom, the Climate Change Committee looks very carefully at what kinds of changes might be involved, and embedded in those stories will be some carbon prices. And the third route is the sort of rather global integrated assessment models. They can be helpful on their, in terms of looking at coherence across different assumptions across the world, but they suffer a big defect in the sense that they can't easily cope with learning, which is at the heart of the story, and they can't easily cope with economies of scale. It's one of the really big problems of general equilibrium modelling ever since, for a very long time, that dealing with learning and dealing with economies of scale is very hard to put into those models. Sometimes it doesn't matter all that much. This time, in this context, it matters enormously. So they're the third, not the first of the places that we go. Now, what about the pattern over time? Well, there are quite a lot of quite difficult issues involved in the pattern over time. There's the simple sort of hotelling story of the optimal exploitation of natural resources, which looks at discounting over time. It looks at rising marginal costs as you try to extract, and those have some relevance here and point to rising prices over time. But learning is very important. How do you introduce strong learning? Learning is at the heart of the story. How do you give a clear, strong signal that this really is the direction that you're going in? Well, one answer to that question would be to bump up prices quickly and strongly, and people will really see that there's a powerful incentive. Another way around would be to promise to have prices rising over time so that people see an incentive that way. You can argue it both ways. I tilt a little bit towards the former because telling people that prices are going to rise steadily over time and then having lots of people lobbying you so that they don't is a scenario that you can imagine. And being a European, it's a scenario that we've observed. So you can tell those stories either way, but in thinking about prices over time, you have to think about the hotelling, rising marginal extraction cost sort of arguments. You have to think of learning and economies of scale kind of arguments. And you have to think of bringing people with you and credibility stories as well. They all count, and you have to think about those things. There's not one formulaic answer to increasing over time and where you start. But I think we inclined a little bit to the story that you have to move strongly now because we're so far away from where we need to be, and then move upwards over time. Having said that they vary across places, I think it's important to recognize that the signaling efficiency role of prices is an important one. And if the world as a whole does all this well, you might expect a few decades from now to see carbon prices starting to come into or towards a common value. Now, what do you do with the money? Well, it depends where you are. In some places, taxation is a word that drives people to, throw tea into harbours and that sort of things. In other parts of the world, people think of it as an essential element in a responsible state that has lots to do to invest in education infrastructure. Opinions vary, right? You can see where I stand. But you do have to ask what to do with the revenues. Because you do, it is important. I mean, you can just use them to pay down the debt if that's what you want to do. But you can't leave that question completely hanging. And so whilst we don't, as it were, major on that question. We do point out the different possibilities and suggest that in different circumstances they'll have different attractiveness. So you wouldn't expect all countries to do the same thing. I mean, reducing other taxes, particularly distortive taxes, particularly in a progressive way, if you can, would be one way. Helping to manage the change in terms of poor people or managing vested interests. You know, you sometimes think vested interests don't deserve to be managed, but you do have to. That's a fact of life, and that's a story which you can't discard. And of course, R&D and learning are terribly important in this whole story, as is investment in infrastructure, and sustainable infrastructure is the heart of all this, as I hope I made clear right at the beginning. Complementary policies, well, I've already alluded to the many other market failures which are fiercely relevant in this context, but in this slide here we emphasize what those other policies might be. I won't go into all the detail. You know, efficiency standards, R&D, land and forest management, trying to get capital markets to cope better with risk in the longer term. Critically important here because high cost of capital not only deters investment as a whole, it changes the nature of the investment because many of the more renewable technologies have capital up front in order to save on running costs down the track. So the cost of capital is of fundamental importance here, and there's a great deal that can be done about that, particularly, in my view, with the multilateral development bank. So those are the things which come, as it were, with carbon pricing. Again, different polities will make different choices here, but they're very powerful, good, solid economic arguments for putting a package together which deals with not just the big externality of greenhouse gases, that market failure, but the other relevant market failures as well. The lower is your action outside the carbon price, the higher generally the carbon price would have to be in order to deliver the reductions. And so what are the conclusions? Well, I'm not going to tell you what carbon prices we come up with, but you're intelligent people, so I'll give you some clues as to where we might be going. Well, first, we know that the current promises on the table in nationally determined contributions are together for 2030 in the Paris Agreement, are together far too low. Paris was very honest about that, so it said, well, look, we reconvene, starting almost now, starting next year, to get together to work out how we can ramp up. And examples of good policies are going to feed into that kind of discussion. But we can say we are, as a world, far too low. For 2030, the Paris nationally determined contributions point to an increase from about 50 billion tons CO2 equivalent now to 55 or more in 2030. In other words, the Paris promises on the table around a 10% increase or more over the next 15 or 20 years. We actually need a 20% decrease. So that is for the Paris target itself of well below 2 degrees. So that is an indication that we have to ramp up. If pricing policy is, as we believe it is, central to that, it's pretty clear that we're going to conclude that carbon pricing should be a lot higher than carbon prices now, which are, ballpark on average $10 a ton CO2 or less. So it's clear that there's going to have to be a ramp up in policy all round, including in carbon prices. But we also make the point that they won't be the same everywhere, they'll vary across countries, and that they'll have to rise over time. And that's why we will be thinking of, as it were, corridors where there's a range. If you have very weak complementary policies, you might expect prices to be at the top of the range and so on. So that's the kind of story that we'll be telling. We'll publish in about a month, and then you can read it all and write all about it. But we'd love your thoughts because it's well advanced. That's why we're talking to you, but it is not finished. And so your thoughts on how we express ourselves, what we should say, would be enormously welcome. Let me just make one last point, which I perhaps haven't emphasized strongly enough, and that whatever prices you come up with, credibility is going to be very important. We're talking about investments that take might take decades in their lifetimes. So where prices are going to go is very important. You can't offer people certainty. The world is not like that. But you can try to work to reduce uncertainty, and the credibility of prices will be very important. And we've learned a bit about that, the role of institutional structures, and not to bang on about my own country, which is not in that brilliant a state, but it does have climate change legislation and a climate change committee, which helps, as it were, and it looks for targets 15, 20 years down the track. It monitors as to how well we're doing, and those are kinds of institutional frameworks that can give you confidence. Presence of a multilateral development bank can also give confidence. So to say that nobody can give cast iron promises is not to say that we can do nothing about credibility. There's quite a lot that we can do about credibility. Let me leave it there. And I first began working with Joe when we were walking around in Kenya in 1969, arguing about growth theory and capital theory and so on. It's been one of the great pleasures of my life to be working with him ever since. Thank you.
So thank you very much for inviting us and give us this opportunity to talk. We're only about half an hour late, so I'll try to be a little brief in my remarks. That's always a mistake for me to say that because I am never brief. But Nick has covered most of the issues, and let me just sort of reiterate a couple of points that he raised. The first was that this is a dynamic process. It's dynamic public economics. And one way to bring that home is I first became very deeply involved in these issues in the early 90s when I was on the IPCC panel that looked at climate change. And the only mistake that we made in our assessment, the second assessment, was that we underestimated the seriousness of the problem. To give you an example, though, of the caution that we had was that we were pretty sure that one of the aspects of climate change was not just an increase in temperature, but also weather variability. But the evidence was not sufficiently strong for us to make a strong statement about weather variability. And since then, the evidence has become overwhelming, and now subsequent assessments have emphasized that. But if you look back, both, where we are today, 20 years, a little more than 20 years later, 27 years later, things have changed so much that it's clear that one could not have solved a optimal dynamic programming problem in the absence of uncertainty and gotten anything right. Solar costs have come down far faster than anybody would have anticipated. At the same time, climate change has proceeded far faster than most people had anticipated. And that, since the IPCC was dominated by real scientists, not by economists, we were very sensitive to the uncertainties in which we were engaged, and it was very much part of how we framed it. But I say one other thing just to comment on is that even then, as I say, it was so clear that it was important, and it was enlisting some of the most talented people in the world. And one of the co-authors of a chapter that I wrote for that report was Ken Arrow, who is one of the great thinkers of the last 100 years. And we wrote a chapter on how do you deal with uncertainty. So it was clear that this was going to be with us and that there was a lot of uncertainty. And therefore, one has to think about policy responses within that context. So just three other points. The first is the fact that that addressing problems of climate change can be done in a way that is totally consistent with maintaining robust economic growth. And this is obviously particularly important for developing countries because they need to catch up. But it's also true for developed countries like the United States, which are performing very anemically, and so are worried about it. So we are very convinced that one can approach the issue of addressing climate change in ways that are pro-growth. Of course, that highlights the importance of addressing the problem in an efficient way, and carbon pricing is an essential aspect of addressing climate change in an efficient way. But one of our senses was very strongly is it's an instrument that's very important, both explicit pricing and implicit pricing, and the use of pricing and cost-benefit analysis, the use of pricing internal to the firm, but that it will have to be accompanied by other instruments. There are a whole range of other market failures, a whole range of concerns like distribution concerns that need to be brought into the analysis, and that therefore, while carbon pricing is absolutely essential, it's not the only instrument. And the reason why one needs to take that on board is to make the changes necessary to get down to essentially zero emissions is going to take very large changes in the structure of our society and the structure of our economy. It's going to change not just in the way we produce electricity, but also in transport, but how we arrange our living and our work. And much of that occurs in the public sector through decisions about infrastructure. Much of that, and so, broadly, our report addresses the major transformative changes that will have to be necessary. It's not the old debate about regulations versus prices. It's really regulations and prices, that one needs both of these as important instruments for going forward. The final point I'll make is that I hope that our report will help develop a consensus behind the use of this important instrument of carbon pricing. There's a lot of NGOs, a lot of people have been working on this for a long time, longer, and I think this may be the moment where we can finally push successfully so that we will have things like carbon taxes and carbon pricing used throughout the world, throughout our economy. But when that happens, it's important that there's a broad sense of what those carbon prices ought to be. What are the ranges? Not a single number, but a range of numbers. And hopefully our report will help provide a focal point for the international community to start thinking about what kinds of prices would generate the beginning issue that Nick emphasized, what kinds of prices would generate elicit the kinds of responses that would enable the world to achieve the goal of 2 degrees or maximum increase in temperature of 1.5 degrees. And that goal we should keep in mind, and this is an important instrument for achieving that goal. Thank you.